Hello, I'm Father James Hagel, pastor of St. Gabriel Parish here in Chestermere, and I'd like to share with you a three-part series about Jesus. Our salvation is a person. I heard this phrase from a speaker that I heard last year, and I thought this statement rather profound. That our salvation is a person, Jesus. And really, that's the core of the Christian message, to introduce people to Jesus. Sometimes we can get caught up in morality and what we should or should not do, but the core Christian message is to introduce people to Jesus. He is our salvation. Also, our salvation is a person, Jesus. And so what I hope to do in these series of talks is to introduce you to Jesus, the person who saves us. And where I'd like to start is with the cross. St. Paul says, I preach Christ and Him crucified. And really that cross is the center where we need to start. And the imagery I'd like to use to describe it is that of drowning. Jesus comes to teach us how to swim, to save us from being drowned. God doesn't give us a branch from outside the river, even though He can do this sometimes. Nor is Jesus there to reward those who are already good swimmers. Instead, He teaches us from in the water how to be saved. To understand this imagery, you have to think about maybe the good versus the bad. And the good, obviously, is Jesus. He's on the side there to save us. And the bad is sin and death. Now, sin, I think, can be easily understood, at least easier than how death relates to it. Because sin binds us, it holds us, it keeps us in. And what happens is we have no way to kind of sometimes get away from it, or it's so hard to get away from it. The example I like to use is looking for my keys. I always keep my keys in my front right pocket. But if they're not there, I'll then look at my front left pocket, and then sometimes my breast pocket, and my back pockets. And the fourth place I look is back to that front right pocket. It wasn't there 5 seconds ago. It won't have magically appeared there, but nevertheless, I look for it there anyway. And that's kind of what the habit of sin is like. For today's example, I think everyone can relate to the idea of touching your face, that we're asked not to do that as much because it spreads viruses to our cells more easily. How hard is it not to touch your face, though? To make that choice to not do it because it's so automatic is so difficult. And that's an example of how sin binds us. St. James says in his letter, in a very beautiful way to connect this sin to death. He says, sin, when fully grown, gives birth to death. Basically, it comes down to putting disorder in our world. And the ultimate disorder is coming to that point of death, where we don't have hope. And so what God does is He gives us something new, a different way in interacting with the world. God puts us in relationship with Jesus. So that sin, or drowning, to use the image I just described, has no power over us. And rather than doing it from outside the river, God's Son became human to die on a cross, the cross we talked about at the start, so that this horrible form of capital punishment might in turn be the means of our salvation. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? St. Paul says. And so our salvation is a person, Jesus, who died on the cross. Now, I want to circle back to something that I went over quite quickly, is that Jesus gives us this gift freely. He doesn't do so because we merit it, as I said in the image of being a good swimmer, but because we need God's help. And basically, it's that free gift that God gives us. And it reminds me of a heroic action of saving someone. And you can think of many examples, I'm sure, but the one that comes to mind for me is Russ Fee, who saved a neighboring campsite last year from a wolf attack that was attacking the tent beside them. And indeed, this July 1st, the Governor General awarded him the Governor General's Award for bravery, for that act of bravery that he did. His heroic action saved someone. Similarly, Jesus too gives us the gift of salvation freely to anyone who chooses it. And we do so by clinging to Jesus. In a very real sense, Jesus is our lifeguard. And so sin and this full birth of death have lost their power. And so Jesus rose from the dead after 3 days in the tomb to be like us in all things, even death. The resurrection says that our hope is sure. The person of Jesus is our salvation.